Brilliant. You look a bit nervous. Why are you nervous?
Lots of memories from this neck of the woods and this church.
Yes. So this very church is, you came to Girls' Brigade here and things, is that right?
Yeah, and my tunic, my spotlessly white plimsolls to do PE with Flo Gordon. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. And was a Sunday school teacher of yours here that said hello?
Yes,
or?
I seen her earlier on. She's hiding now. Hi.
How amazing, how amazing. Well, you've come so far and you've come back as well. We were just talking earlier about our claims to fame. Brenda's got some very intimidating claims to fame. You know, my greatest claim to fame, I don't think I told you this, my greatest claim to fame is I once sang a duet with Tony Hadley of Spandau Ballet.
Impressive.
Right. Yeah, I know. We sang Who's the King of the Jungle together. In a school, I was doing a school assembly, and Tony Hadley was there because it was his school, and I got him up, and so we sang it. I don't think he remembers it, but I remember it. So that's my claim to fame, and I thought that was a pretty good claim to fame until I met you. And tell me, like, if you were to name a top 3 of name drops that you could just drop into a conversation. Oh yeah, I had tea with so-and-so. Who would be in your top 3?
President Obama would be number 3.
That'd be number 3, bronze medal. Bronze medal. He's on the podium. Well done, Barrick.
Hillary Clinton would be number 2.
Okay. Wow.
And Her Majesty the Queen would be number 1.
Wow. And you told me that she sat on your table at dinner, didn't she?
Yeah. I didn't sit in her table, she sat on mine.
And you said she was a good laugh as well.
She's really sociable and made everyone feel at ease. We were all a little in awe of her and just sort of looking at her, but she just set the whole table at ease and cracked a few jokes, and it was very, very nice.
Now, in what capacity did you meet all these 3 people?
As an MLA for Lagan Valley.
Amazing, amazing. So politics. We'll get back to some of the reasons why you got into it in a second, but perhaps tell us a little bit, what is it that fired you up for political life?
I was always very political as a child. I was 10 years old when Margaret Thatcher was elected, and my dad called me into the sitting room and the news was on, and he says, "Brenda, come and see this." He said, "A woman Prime Minister, this is really important for Western Europe." And that just sort of caught my imagination, and if I was really well behaved, I was allowed to stay up and watch the 9 o'clock news as a treat. I didn't tell any boyfriends that, by the way. And so my interest was piqued then, and as an army wife, we moved around a lot, but I always registered to vote, and I always voted and made my hubby vote the same way that I voted, as all good wives should. And then it sort of went on a back burner until much later on in my life, yes, when I was asked to stand for the DUP in the 2011 election.
Yeah, and we might talk about some of the passionate issues which you wanted to represent in politics. So tell us about growing up. Tell us about your household growing up here in Bangor.
Well, I grew up in Bangor. I went to this GB until the age of 16. And I said my mum was a GB officer in here, and my dad helped start a pipe band up, and then it was called Ballyreed Pipe Band. So a lot of activities were involved with the band and GB here in the old church halls as they were then. So if I wasn't practicing my skipping for GB competition, I was out with my dad and Ian MacDonald and Mr. Ian Kerr. Was it? Mr. Kerr, chopping wood to raise money for pipe band uniforms.
Okay, amazing.
Exciting.
Amazing. And someone's waving at us. Oh, there we go.
Junk.
A drummer? Are you a drummer?
Yeah, my
very
dad
good.
was a drummer, yeah.
Very good. Good. And at what stage did you kind of leave Bangor?
I left Bangor at the age of 19 because shortly after leaving this GB, I met a really tall, handsome Dorset boy.
Called Mark.
Called Mark.
Yes. What do you remember? When you first clapped eyes on him, was it love at first sight?
No, I didn't like him.
Okay.
I thought he was arrogant and rude, and I couldn't understand a word he was saying, because he had a thick Dorset drawl, and he didn't know what Vita bread was, and he had no idea what a proper pasty was, or potato, cheese, and onion, so I wasn't too sure it was going to work out at all.
You were star-crossed lovers from across the
bit.
sea. Yeah. And were you in the army at this stage? Or
No, I was never in the army. It was Mark that was in the
Mark.
army. So I asked him what was he doing here in Northern Ireland, and he said what all good soldiers said, and he said he was in the fire brigade. And he was on holiday in Bangor in 1985 from London. Yeah.
Okay.
That worked.
Okay. And did you twig straight away when he said fire?
Oh, immediately. This was the middle of the Troubles, and he, being 6'4" and a really short haircut, he stood out a mile.
Yes. Okay. But clearly, deep down, you had some feelings for him straight away. No.
It's sort of grew, as they said, but off he went to Cross Maglen for 6 weeks, not long after we met.
Okay.
And that was a fly-in, fly-out army barracks. So he, and there was no such thing as mobile phones, and he couldn't send blueies, which is the communication that the army use. So we relied on weekly phone calls. So it was a slow burner to start off with. Yeah.
Okay. And at what stage did you jump in with both feet and think this is the guy for you?
When I had to introduce him to my parents. I was always warned to stay away from soldiers. Nice girls didn't go with soldiers, and also there was also the security aspect. You brought a soldier to your home, people would see him coming in at your house. It was dangerous for him, and it was dangerous for you as a family. But I don't know, my heart and my hormones were raging, and I introduced him to my mum and dad. And the biggest mistake that Mark made that night was my dad came downstairs and he said, "Nice to meet you, Mark," and put his hand out to shake his hand. And Mark just said, "Cheers, mate." And I just thought, oh, this is over before it's even begun. And my dad, we sat in the kitchen having a cup of tea, and my dad sat in the sitting room the whole time. He wouldn't leave me alone with him.
Wow. But did they come around to him in the end?
Oh yes, Dad overheard a conversation one night. I wanted to do something, and Mark just said, "No, Brenda," and I mean no. And my dad turned around and said to my mum, "She'll marry him." and I did.
And you did. At what age? What age were you when you married?
I was 19. I'd just been accepted into uni to do social work, and I dropped out to move to England to marry him at 19. He was 20, and found myself by the Christmas of that year with a mortgage living in Poole, Dorset.
Goodness me. And so he was in the army from the age of, 17? Or
16, yeah.
16, goodness me. And so lots of travel involved with that, lots of postings?
Yeah, lots of travelling. Our first couple of years of married life were based in Bulford in Wiltshire, and then we went to Germany for 7 years, and then came back to Plymouth and Warminster and London, and then the regiment eventually returned to Ballykilner, which is down near Newcastle on the coast.
Tell me about the happy times. What do you remember from early married life?
Mark was a big fitness freak, so he did lots of weights and played lots of rugby, and it was just all to do around fitness and our close friends. And one of our closest friends went off to New Zealand to meet some family and came back a Christian. Okay. So, and that was a bit strange for me. When we first got married, we found out that Mark was a Jew. Now, Mark didn't even know he was a Jew until he tried to get married in an Anglican church, and he couldn't give them the name of his parish. And so we found out he was a Jew, and he was like, "Oh my goodness, my Jewish background and stuff." And so when we started to talk about Jesus, who he didn't even know Jesus was a Jew either, it was a learning path for him. And I think watching Mark read and come to faith was a bit of an eye-opener for me, because I had always went to church. I went to church here. I went to First Bangor Youth Fellowship. I went to West Church Outreach. I went to Rosemary Park Baptist. I was a bit of a ecumenical gypsy. I moved around them all. And so knew about God, knew all about the stories, but really hadn't done much about what I knew.
What do you think it was that was really speaking to Mark about Jesus? What do you think was really clicking with him?
Mark's journey to faith was a theoretical one. He sat down and read everything about Christianity, but he also compared it to Judaism and Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons. He wanted to know all the ins and outs, and settled with Christianity. It was the one that was most relevant. And when he went into the background knowledge as well, that there was more evidence for Jesus than there was for Julius Caesar, and that other historians at the time were writing about Jesus, that was very real to him. And I think God moved him in a way that he hadn't expected, and I certainly hadn't expected, because I was the one that went to church. I was the so-called Christian. I knew more about him, and God just raised Mark way above me in his knowledge, which was amazing.
What did you notice about how he was changing now that he was becoming a Christian?
He was more open. Mark was the sort of guy other guys like to hit. He had that sort of face, and every time we went down, even though he never started a fight, a scuffle would ensue, and Mark would have to take care of it very quickly, and he was very able to do it. And what I found was that more and more of these scuffles happened, Mark just removed himself from the situation. Mm-hmm. And later on in his faith, when he was witnessing to the guys in the regiment, he had this T-shirt, and it was a white T-shirt, and he got it from the American PX, and it was Jesus on the ground with the crown of thorns and the cross, and it just said, bench press this, the sins of the world. Wow. So you've got Mark standing there, 18 and a half stone of pure muscle. I mean, he was a really fit guy, wearing this T-shirt, and he would go to the pubs and the clubs, and I would go with him, and he'd just stand at the bar, and the guys and the young soldiers and squaddies would come up to him and say, what's your T-shirt all about? And Mark would say, and he would start to witness that way, and that was, so rather than downing pints, he was maybe downing 1 or 2 pints, but just giving a really valid and viable witness to serving soldiers.
Amazing. And what was it like for you? So, I mean, you had a church background and you'd gone to Sunday school, you knew all the stories, but if I'd asked you aged 18, who is Jesus, what would you have said at that point?
Just someone else to tell me of. Someone else to make me feel guilty. Mm-hmm. Someone else, he was the Son of God, and I was really good at Christmas, and I knew all the stories, but when I got older, I would commit my life because I didn't want to have a really boring life by being a Christian too young.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You'd put it off, maybe on your deathbed, or maybe just before your deathbed.
Yeah, someone always said you should never use Christianity as a fire escape from hell. Well, I was.
Yeah.
I waited until I was dead.
So what changed for you? I mean, obviously, you're seeing your husband, you're seeing the changes in his life. And what was it that you were seeing that was making you think differently?
I think the fact that Andrew, his friend, had come back from Australia with a new wife, and we were just talking about Jesus all the time, and I was telling Mark what I knew about it, and Andrew's knowledge was much more deeper than I, and his relationship with God was light years ahead of mine, and I think just talking about it all the time, we'd do weight training and stuff, and we'd go out, but then we'd come back and have dinner, have a bottle of wine, and just sit down and talk about the Bible, and not just talk about the Old Testament, but it was the New Testament, and we just moved between the two, and really brought Jesus alive to me. And also when I also seeing the historical evidence for Jesus as well, you realize actually this guy really is real. I mean, I don't doubt Julius Caesar for 1 second, or Marcus Aurelius, but at times I would have doubted Jesus, and this just really brought him by like a modern contemporary peer, nearly.
He was real. Thing was real. Okay, we'll think about how faith has helped you in various ways. But what's it like being a soldier's wife?
There's an old song. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. The army is a really good life, and the moves were exciting. I liked moving around all the time. I liked moving to new places and meeting new people, and I really enjoyed the traveling bit. The army really changed for us after 9/11, and we were living in Twickenham at the time when the Twin Towers were hit, and Mark was on public duties, and London went into high alert. There was scares on the tubes all the time. We couldn't take the tubes. The guys were all called back into camp. All leave was cancelled, and we had a conversation that evening, and we just knew that was going to change army life. And Mark was away a lot, but when he was home, he was home. But after 9/11, he was just away a lot and never home. And that's when our family life really changed.
So who was born when? You've got 2 daughters.
My eldest, Victoria Tori, was born here in the Ulster Hospital in 1993. I was 25. Mark was on a tour of West Belfast, and I was pregnant in Germany, and there was no way I was having my baby in Germany on my own. So my mother, who hated flying, got on a flight with her friend and came to pick me up, and I came home and stayed here for 6 months while Mark was in White Rock. And then when we lived in London 2001, little Alex came along. So there's 8 years of difference, and it wasn't planned that way. That's just, I'm a soldier's wife. They have to be home.
So from 2001 onwards, he's away a lot more. Where? Where is he going?
He went to Iraq. Went to Bosnia when it was kicking off in the mid-90s, the Falklands, and 6 tours of Northern Ireland, 2 of which were undercover. And I never really worried about him coming here, because I sort of know, when he knew his job, he was working really closely with the PSNI, or the RUC as it was then, surrounded by professionals, and he loved his job out here. My biggest worry was when the regiment would get told they were going to Afghanistan, and they'd just come back from a tour of Kosovo, and I thought they were going to be home for a couple of years, but Afghanistan was taking its toll, and the army in general, and he just came home that night, and he just looked me in the eye, and he said, I've got a bit of news for you, and I'm like, what? And I started to shake, because I thought, I'm not going to like this bit, and he just said, we're being sent to Afghanistan in 12 months.
And that was in 2008, 2009?
2008, but before regiment deploy, they spend 6 to 10 months training before they go.
Okay. So what's that like? He's in Afghanistan, you're watching the news. 2009 was a horrific time for the... I mean, how many soldiers were lost in Afghanistan in that year?
We lost 101 in 6 months.
That's insane, yeah. And you're watching that on the news, and your girls are how old at that stage?
Tori was 15 and Alex was 7 years old, and Mark deployed to Afghanistan on the 2nd of April. And within 3 or 4 days, we'd already lost 2 soldiers. They were killed. So it started immediately. And it got to the point I had to stop watching the news because I knew what was going to be on the news. And we weren't losing guys 1 or 2, we were losing 3 at a time, 5 at a time, 4 at a time, multiple life-changing injuries. And when you started seeing the coffins coming through Wooten Bassett and people's grief all over the news, I just didn't want my girls to see that. And so we didn't have the television on. I didn't have the radio on in the car anymore. And you're just really trying to hold it together while you're operating at a really high level of emotional stress, waiting on the emails coming through every morning, waiting on the odd letter, and waiting on the twice weekly phone calls. Mark would phone every Wednesday and Sunday evening, and he would phone at bedtime so he could say Alexandra's prayers. So he would have a chat to me and have a chat to Tori, then I'd run upstairs and give the phone to Alex, and Mark would say her nighttime prayers and say goodnight to her, and then he would hang up.
And your prayers are constantly, Lord protect him, Lord protect him.
My prayers were from a Christian wife, praying for a Christian husband, for angels to be at his feet to protect him from IEDs, for him to be a witness to his soldiers, and for God to bring him home to us.
And that prayer was not answered in the way that you prayed it?
No, not at all.
So tell us about the day when there were 2 officials from the army, they knocked at the door.
The day before, August 12th, it was a really hot, sunny day, and Alex was at summer school, at her prep school, and Tori was at a work experience at a local newspaper in Banbridge. And I picked both girls up, and we're driving around Lisburn, and the phone rings, and it was an English number that I recognised as a military number from Afghanistan. So I handed the phone to Tori, and she's chittering away to her dad, and they put the phone on to Alex, and they chitter away. And then I pull over, and I say, just to know how's work going, and he just said, oh, it's getting busy. It was 1 week before the Afghan elections. And I said, how are things going? And he says, we're in the middle of Exercise Panther's Claw. And he said, we're just really busy, Bren. He says, I'm just flat out. And I said, what are you doing this weekend? He says, well, nothing much. And I said, Mark, please stay in. Just stay safe. And he said, staying in is boring. And I said to him, can you phone in Sunday night as usual? And he said, well, that won't be an issue. He says, I'll speak to you on Sunday. And I said, I love him. And I hung up. Got up the next morning, and I checked my email, which became a habit. The first thing I did was I would check my email, and there was no email. And I just started to feel really, really sick. Both girls are still in bed. I hadn't woken them up yet. So I turned on BBC News and looked at CFAX, and there was nothing on the news or CFAX. And then I just started to shake, because that meant there had been an incident. And MOD had closed all the communications down until families had been informed. And we'd only lost a guy 2 days before, so you're sort of thinking, oh, it's still very fresh in your mind. I wake the girls up, don't say anything to them, but Tori had also checked for her emails and realised her dad hadn't emailed her, because he emailed us all every day. And I dropped the girls when they needed to be, did my shopping, didn't go straight home, went to my sister's house. And she said, did you heard from Mark? And I said, I haven't heard from Mark yet. And I talked about how we had issues getting life insurance. Nobody would insure Mark. And the only sort of insurance he could get was through the army, which only insured him up to £150,000. And we'd looked to get other life insurance from one of the big insurers, but they wouldn't insure them. And so we had the conversation about the guys not being able to be covered. And I came home and I noticed a car that I wasn't familiar, just sitting on the corner, and I thought, no. I clocked it because this is Northern Ireland. My hubby's in the army, and I thought that's an unusual car, but sort of put it to the back of my mind. Went into the kitchen, dumped all my shopping, opened my laptop, and there's no email. And just bile was rising in my throat. Turned the television on immediately, and there's still nothing on the news. So I sent another email to Mark, and it was just, sweetie, really, really worried. Email me when you get this. I love you so much. And as I pressed send, my front door knocked.
And you knew instantly what that meant?
I knew even before I walked to the door what it was going to be. And there was a man and woman standing on my doorstep, and they just said, are you the wife of Captain Mark James Hale? And I just shut the door. And my teeth began to chatter violently. But I knew I couldn't leave them on the doorstep. I had to let them in, and I opened the door, and they somehow ushered me to my sofa, sat me down, and just said, very matter-of-factly, as I suppose they have to, we regret to inform you that Captain Hale died this morning in Afghanistan.
And your world falls apart at that.
I didn't believe them. Right. I said, no, you've got the wrong Mark. What's his date of birth? I was speaking to him yesterday. He's phoning me on Sunday. You've made a big cock up, and you need to go and be sure what you're telling people, and this isn't right. And they just were very firm, and they said, it's your Mark.
Goodness me. And what are the first thoughts that are going through your head once you accept that that's the news?
I'm going to have to tell my girls, Daddy's not coming home.
How do you do that?
It has been the hardest thing that I have ever had to do in my life. Alex had just got brand new school shoes the day before, and Tori was still at work. And I knew for 2 hours before I went to get them, and I phoned my sister, Gillian, and I said, can you get Alex from... Well, actually, no, I didn't do it. My neighbour did it, my friend. I wasn't able to. And we made arrangements for Alex to be picked up from her summer scheme, and my other friend drove me to Banbridge to get Tori. And as soon as Tori seen me in the back seat, she just started to scream and scream and scream. Not my daddy, not my daddy. And I managed to get her into the back seat of the car, and she went, it should be me. It shouldn't be my daddy, it should be me. And got her home, and by this stage, Alex was home, and she was on my sister's hip, and I had to say to her, listen, sweetie, Daddy's in heaven, because the army took him to Afghanistan, and Jesus just brought him straight to heaven. And she just said, but can he come home at the weekend and see my new shoes? And it was just, so you completely and utterly implode. this man, who I met when I was 16, was absolutely the love of my life and my soulmate. And I thought God was looking after us. A few weeks before, Mark had been confirmed his next posting to Lisburn. And so we sort of thought, that's 2 years at home, he's not having to go away. And Mark really wanted this posting in Lisburn, so we thought this was God working in our lives. And God literally pulled the rug out from under my feet.
And what did that do to your faith?
Initially, that first night, Tori moved her mattress into my room, and Alex slept in the bed beside me on her daddy's side, and Tori slept on the floor on her dad's side. And we were able to pray, thank you, Jesus, for taking Mark into heaven, because we knew he was in heaven. We absolutely knew he was in heaven. But at the same time, I just had this anger rising in me that I did everything the Bible asked me to do. I did everything the way the Bible guides you to do in prayer. And it didn't matter. And that anger consumed me, I would say, for nearly 6 months. I couldn't even go to my church. But luckily my minister came to me, so that was a blessing in disguise. Very patient man.
The comforts that people offer in those moments, nobody knows what to say, do they? But I'm sure some things that were said were very helpful and some things that were said were less helpful. Were there good examples of people coming alongside you and helping in these moments?
Oh, cracky, yeah. The day that I was informed that Mark had been killed, an army padre came to me and he sat down and he said, he started saying very the usual things you say, about grief and about death. And I just looked at him and I thought, I don't know who you are. And you certainly don't know who my Mark was. My Mark was the sort of guy that when we became Christians in Germany and our padre wasn't a Christian, and Mark was horrified at this, so rather than tied to the military church, we went out and bought the Alpha course, and we did the Alpha course from home. And this was back in the early 90s when, like I said to you, Nicky Gumbel wasn't really well known, but we were doing the Alpha course with the soldiers. Mark was the guy that when the padre in Afghanistan wasn't able to go to the front line, Mark went to the front line instead and gave communion and prayed and witnessed to the guys. Mark was the guy who the young soldiers would say, Sarah, come out and patrol with us, because if you're with us, that means your God is here. And my Mark would say, your God's out there too. And Mark was the guy who, when 3 of his guys were caught into a blast, witnessed his Christian faith by walking into that bomb to bring his boys out.
Yeah, because that's what happened, wasn't it? There was one IED went off, and then he went back into where that was to carry somebody out.
Yeah, one IED went off, and 3 soldiers were injured, and Mark Balmered a pathway to get the first one. And Balmer's where they use their metal detectors to check for IEDs, and he made the pathway clear, and he got the first casualty back. Bringing back the second casualty, the medic had started to come round and started to deliver first aid, and then Mark went to get the 3rd casualty, and a young soldier, Danny Wild, age 19, the height and build of me, but huge courage, started to shout, who's going to help the boss, who's going to help the boss? And Danny went with Mark to bring back Matthew Hatton, who was the least injured, but was still missing half his face. And they put Matthew between their shoulders, and Danny stepped on the 2nd IED, which killed him and Matthew immediately, and Mark died later of his injuries in Bastion. And even after the blast, they couldn't land the helicopter because the rotation of the blades was setting off IEDs in the area. The area was littered with IEDs. And that particular patrol, it took them an extra 18 hours to get back into camp because they just hit one blast after the other. And I spoke to my own minister. He came out 2 days afterwards, and I said, why Mark? And he said, Brenda, because Mark was ready to go. He walked into that blast knowing, should anything happen? And that's where I have to feel that my prayers were answered. Angels were at Mark's feet. But they just weren't there to bring him home.
So he dies literally saving another. He dies literally trying to bring
One of his boys back.
Bring one of his boys back. You must be so proud of him.
I mean, that's a blessing and a burden, isn't it?
Right.
My girls are now without their dad, but
Right.
but at the same time, when he was hit by the blast, the guys then went to help him, and then they lay on their bellies and hand-picked out IEDs so the helicopter could land to bring him to hospital. So the courage and the bravery of the whole platoon, stuff of movies.
Yeah. So tell me, how do you process the anger? You said for like 6 months after, there was just pure anger. You weren't able to go to church and that kind of thing. How do you overcome that? How do you move through that?
I didn't go to church, but my minister came to me, and it was just through talks with Bobby Little. I go to Legacurry near Lisburn, and it was just through talks with him, and even things to when it came to bury Mark. Bobby said to me, Brenda, what are you going to do with Mark? And I looked at him like he was from Mars. Like, what do you mean what I'm going to do with him? I'm going to bring him home. My initial thought was to put him in the garden, so he was close to us, and I know that sounds nuts, but I can only think, well, actually, he has to come home to us. And we talked about cremation and burial, and we decided to bury him. And I said, and then Bobby said, where are you going to bury him? Well, again, I thought, well, the garden. And then I thought, no, but we're going to France. We're moving to France. That was our plan, to move to France. And I didn't know what to do. And then Bobby came back the next day and said, there's a plot for you in Legacurry. And I'm like, what do you mean? And he said, someone has given you their family plot. And I said, well, why would they do that? Because we lived under the radar. Legacurry, again, being an army family, just didn't want to be too public. And he just said, because Mark laid down his life for his friends.
Wow.
And to this day, I still don't know who gave me that plot.
Wow.
And if that's not Christian love,
Yeah.
I don't know what is.
Yeah. So tell me, as you process all of this, in what ways have you seen God's hand in the aftermath?
I don't like spooky or supernatural stuff, and I think God knows this, but it became spooky and supernatural. It's things like, I decided to sell the house, and I didn't know what to do with it, and an estate agent came round, and she just happened to be from my church. And it was when the market had just started to dip, and I said, I don't want people walking around my house. And she says, listen, I'll just do the best I can. And my house went on the market on the Friday, and I sold it on the Monday. The first people that looked around, so I didn't have people going around my house. But it was a girl from my church who was the estate agent. And even when I was thinking of moving, I would just open my Bible every day to see what would happen. And I kept getting Lot and Abraham to move and don't look back and move. And I thought, oh, this is getting a wee bit scary stuff. So I sort of put that to aside. And then I found a house in Hillsborough and thought, oh, I'm meant to move here. And again, I opened up and I got Ezekiel 43, which is where God talks about building the new temple and moving forward. But the verse in Ezekiel 43 said, I think it was verse 5, it just says, and the man is here, the man was there. And I took that to be that man is Mark. That even though I was moving, I would always have Mark with me in my heart. And then again, when it came to going into politics and just and pushing for the military covenant, because when Mark died, the army had lost my will, had lost Mark's will, and so everything went to probate. So I was left for months and months and months with no money, but told a list of charities that I could go to for oil and school shoes. And I thought, this man was the longest serving soldier to be killed in Afghanistan. He was the 199th soldier to be killed. We had served our country. I followed the flag all over the place. And I'm giving a list of charities where I can go for help. And I thought, the least he deserves is that we're just looked after. Just the way that he looked after us, that the government step into his boots. And it never happened. And so when I thought about politics and I was praying and going to my elders and not getting any answers, it was actually my sister came back. She says, Brenda, I'm getting Esther. But I'm not an Esther. I'm a Jonah. I was trying to run and hide.
But God uses Jonahs, yeah. And so this is the passion that you took into politics, really. And this is, you were telling me about when you met Barack Obama, you said, you're going to meet David Cameron tomorrow. And you briefed him about what he should say to David Cameron. But very much that was about championing the armed services and making sure the military covenant was protected here. And yeah, that's been a real, I guess, legacy that you've taken from this, a kind of a passion to fight for those people.
It is. I mean, the men and women of our armed forces serve our country in ways that we never could. And even you look at now the cyber threat from Russia and everything else that's going on there, they're doing a job when we're all sleeping in bed. And they're doing it for a minimum wage. And they're away from their families. And I think Afghanistan tested the safety net that the MOD had in place. And there was a safety net in place, but I think 2009 was a particularly challenging and difficult year, bloody and deadly, and there was holes in the net. And I just happened to fall through every one of those holes. Our regiment had lots of very, very young widows. And these married to lance corporals and corporals with no life insurance, you know, they were getting kicked out of their houses at the 12-week point. It was just horrific. And all the armed forces ask for is that should anything happen to them, that the government stand by their side of the military covenant, and that is they will lay down their life if they have to. But in return, should that happen, that the government would look after their families. And we have political and historical reasons why it's not happening in Northern Ireland, but that doesn't mean to say it shouldn't happen.
Right. We've got to wrap up, but let me finish with two questions. A big question that people always have about faith is, how can you believe in a good God in a bad world? And that can sound like a very kind of distant philosophical question, but for you it's an intensely personal question. So how do you answer that question? If someone's to ask you, how do you still hold on to a good God when you've gone through the storms you've gone through?
Because I see God everywhere. I see God when I look at my daughters and I see their faith growing. I see God in Mark, and I see God in the love that I still have for Mark. Love doesn't die with death. It only intensifies, and I see God there. So everywhere I look, I see kindness. I also see trouble. But if you look for God, you will find him. It's just don't shut your eyes to it.
And that's my last question. If there are people looking for God, and maybe people here have known God, but they're walking through dark times themselves, how do you look for God? What advice would you give for someone who really wants to have the kind of faith that you've got that sustains them?
I have this sort of relationship with God that I have with Mark. Sometimes I'm speaking to him, sometimes I'm not. And I think my faith, I suppose, is very real in my life. But the verse that converted Mark was Psalm 46, verse 10. Be still and know that I am God. And whenever I was having rough times on the hill, or rough times with my daughters, or just you go home at night from a long day in Stormont, and the girls are away at school, and you're sitting on your own in the dark, and Mark's not there, and you want to say, what do you think about this? What do you do about that? And you want to bounce ideas off him, and he's not there. And sometimes the anger can come back, or the sadness comes back. And then I just think of Mark's verse, and just try to be still. And in the stillness, listen. And in the stillness, breathe. And in the stillness, let go and let God.
It's great advice. Thank you for that. Now, if people want to talk to you afterwards, you're around for a little bit. And don't forget Brenda's book at the back, I Married a Soldier. Is that what it's called? I Married a Soldier. So do pick that up at the back. But let's give a round of applause and thank Brenda. It's beautiful. Thank you very much. Did you notice these John's Gospels on your way in? I'm just going to spend the last 10 minutes just pointing you to what I think is the most profound story about a good God and a bad world that there is in all the Bible. It's halfway through this John's Gospel, this biography of Jesus' life, and it's on page 32. Do you want to open it up? And by the way, if you haven't read the Bible in, let's say, the last month, this is our gift to you. This could be a way of either kickstarting your Bible reading again, or perhaps starting for the first time. This could be a great way of you dipping into God's Word. And here is this biography of Jesus, where the Son of God, that is a chip off the old block, everything that God is like is this person Jesus. He comes to planet Earth to show us what his Father is like. And he is love covered over in skin. That's who Jesus is. And here in this chapter, chapter 11, this good God encounters a suffering world. What happens? Well, you'll see it's headed the death of Lazarus. Now, a man named Lazarus was ill. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay ill, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is ill." Essentially, it's prayer, isn't it? Essentially, it's these two sisters caring for their brother, wanting the Lord to come through, wanting the Lord to do his thing. And so, if you like, they're praying, aren't they? They're asking the Lord to do what they know he can do. They know he has the power to heal. Well, verse 4, little number 4, when Jesus heard this, Jesus said, "This illness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So, when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Do you notice that little word "so" at the beginning of verse 6? Isn't that an infuriating word? Jesus loves Lazarus. He loves Martha. He loves Mary. He loves the whole family. Verse 5 is just establishing that fact. Jesus is full of love. He loves the whole family. Verse 6, so he delays. And in fact, he delays until the nightmare scenario eventuates and Lazarus actually dies. Do you see why the word "so" might be totally infuriating as you read this? It's the sort of word that would make you want to throw this gospel against the wall. What? Jesus, don't you love us? Yeah. No, Jesus really loves us. The God of heaven really, really loves us. That's what makes the problem of suffering such a problem, right? It wouldn't be such a problem if God was callous, if God was indifferent, if God was weak, if God was unloving. The problem of suffering wouldn't be a problem, would it? There'd be no problem. We'd just be like, well, it's a hard old world because we've got a hard old God, and that's it. Deal with it, right? The problem of suffering is such a problem because the Bible insists that God is such a good God. Such a good God. The Bible insists that God is a fountain of light and life and love. There's a Father always loving his Son, Jesus, in the joy of the Holy Spirit. We've come from love. We've been shaped by love. We're intended for love. That's why suffering is such a jarring reality. Because we think, well, this should not be. If God is good, why a suffering world? And actually, we should be asking that question because God is really good. Jesus really loves us. And yet, there is this suffering. Verse 6 says, Jesus delays, and he allows the sick man to die. In a sense, he doesn't answer their prayer, does he? He certainly doesn't answer it in the way that they asked it. So what happens next? If you look at the next page, Jesus comforts the sisters of Lazarus on page 33. Little number 17 means verse 17. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days by the time he gets there. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. I wonder how that sounded. I wonder what sort of tone of voice Martha had when she made that statement to Jesus. Because you could read that a few different ways, couldn't you? You could read it as, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. You know, a statement of great faith, a statement of great confidence. Jesus is the great healer. If you'd been here, nothing bad would have happened. I have great confidence in you. Maybe she said it with that kind of inflection. But you could also say verse 21 in a different way, couldn't you? You could say, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. That's quite a different way of saying it, isn't it? Lord, this is malpractice. What did you? Did you fall asleep at the wheel? What's going on? We prayed. You said you love us. And you have the power to do something about this, and you didn't. What's going on? Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. Do you see how it's a statement of faith and it's a statement of complaint at one and the same time? And the Bible's full of that. The people of faith complain, but they address their complaint to the manager, right? We're not to complain among ourselves, that's called grumbling, but we are to address our complaint to the manager, and the Bible is full of that. There's a book in the Old Testament called the Book of Psalms. It's the longest book in the Bible, 150 songs. A third of them are psalms of lament, where people complain to God, saying, what's going on? Where are you? And Martha and Mary are asking those sorts of questions. Not because they're not believers, but because they are believers. They know Jesus is good. They know Jesus is powerful. So what's going on? They don't know. And so they ask him. And he's got shoulders that are broad enough to handle that. If you're angry at God for things that are going on, you can tell him. Jesus has broad enough shoulders. He can handle that. You can complain. You can lament. The Bible is full of it. What does Jesus do with Martha? Well, in verse 25, he gives a great truth to hang on to. He says to, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Man, you need to cling on to that in the face of death, don't you? To be able to say, my husband's in heaven now. You need to be able to cling on to that through the storm. Jesus is the resurrection and the life. He's like the needle who pierces through the black shroud of death, and he's come out the other side. And whoever lives and believes in him, they are like the thread, and they will be pulled through the same way. Do you believe this? You need to cling on to that truth, the truth of the resurrection, the truth that this world is not all there is. You know, suffering would be absolutely unbearable if we thought this world is all there is. Because then suffering wins, doesn't it? Suffering would have the last word. But according to the Bible, Jesus has the last word. He is the resurrection and the life. We cling onto him like a thread clings onto the needle, and we get pulled through. Martha needed that truth. Perhaps you need that truth tonight. But then there's Mary. Mary comes up to Jesus, and you'll notice over the page that in verse 32, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was, and she saw him, she fell at his feet and said the same thing. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Again, it's that statement of faith and of complaint together. It's okay to complain to God. It's okay to say, this is insufferable. I can't stand this. What's going on? What are you doing? It's more than okay to say that to Jesus. And so Mary comes with the exact same words that her sister came with. So what does Jesus do? Does Jesus just go into the filing cabinet of his mind and bring out the same answer? You know, Martha asked him, and Jesus had the answer. I am the resurrection and the life. Now Mary asks him. Does he just repeat the same answer? No, don't you just love Jesus? He knows that Mary needs something different. He doesn't do a Bible study with Mary. What does he do with Mary? Verse 33, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him, he asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. What a story. Here is God coming to planet Earth. A family that he loves says, please, Lord, can you help? And he can, and he doesn't help them the way they ask. And then there's a funeral, and God shows up to the funeral, and he cries more than everyone else. Isn't that an extraordinary story? Who would make up this story? God comes to planet Earth. He shows up at the funeral, and he's the one crying more than anyone else. He's crying so much everyone else is noticed. We'll see how he loved him. This is a first century Middle Eastern funeral. There would have been professional mourners at this funeral. People genuinely weeping and wailing and tearing their garments and putting ashes on their head. And in amongst all that, the tears of God are the things really drawing people's attention. The tears of God are being shed here. Jesus wept. You know, Jesus doesn't give Mary a Bible study. He gives her tears. And maybe tonight, what I say to you won't make much difference to you. But maybe you just need to know that there's a God of heaven who weeps. He really does weep. In Isaiah chapter 63, it says, in all God's people's affliction, God too is afflicted. Jesus wept, and he weeps for you. We've got such an interesting God. I don't know, you know, when you think about the issue of God and suffering, maybe you think, you know, God is a perfect being and this is an imperfect world, and you try to think of it like this philosophical problem. The Bible doesn't deal with it like that. The Bible deals with a living God who shows up in the midst of the valley of the shadow of death, and he cries more than all the other mourners. God is not immune from the pain. He's not immune from your pain. Jesus wept. He continues to weep with you. So cry out to him and know that there's a God who can cry with you. And then know that there is a future beyond suffering. There really is. This passage, it takes us to the depths, but then it raises us to the heights. Over on page 35, at the top of page 35, here's the conclusion to the story. When Jesus had said this, he called out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. Imagine it. Just imagine it. Here's the funeral. He's been dead 4 days. He's been dead 4 days. All the mourners are there. Lazarus, come out. 3 words from the Son of God. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth round his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. What a story. God comes to earth and allows the funeral to happen. Then he shows up at the funeral, cries more than everyone else, then raises the guy from the dead and turns the funeral into a homecoming. What a story. What an account of God and suffering. It's so different. I don't know if you did religious studies at school. I remember doing religious studies at school. We used to think very wisely and stroke our 15-year-old chins about, what would a perfect God do in an imperfect world? We'd think about, the Bible's so different. It talks about a living God who shows up in the midst of the valley of the shadow of death. And he punches a hole through death, comes out the other side and offers us feasting joy at the end of all things. Because just a few weeks after Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, he too comes through his own death and out the other side into feasting joy. And he says, I'm the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even though they die, yet they will live. Do you believe this? Jesus takes us far lower than we were ever prepared to go and then raises us far higher than we ever dared imagine. Without Jesus, we don't actually have a problem with suffering. If there isn't such a good God, if there isn't a God like Jesus out there, then suffering stops being a problem. It's just the way things are. Deal with it, right? If there is no good God, then this world and its suffering, it's not really wrong. It's just random, right? But if everything's random, nothing is wrong. If you get rid of Jesus, you've actually gotten rid of the problem with suffering. But let me tell you, it's a good thing to have a problem with suffering. The God of heaven has a problem with suffering. He weeps at the graveside. It's good to have a problem with suffering. Jesus lets you have a problem with suffering. And then he joins you in the valley of the shadow and he weeps with you. Get rid of Jesus. You haven't gotten rid of your suffering. You've still got your suffering. You've still got to walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And now you don't have a God of love to walk with you through it. If you're going through suffering, don't get rid of God. That will not get rid of your suffering. All it will do will be to get rid of the only shepherd who can walk you through that valley of the shadow. And then if you get rid of Jesus, you get rid of hope. No one else is offering you a future beyond suffering, a future of immortal physical joy, of feasting and family and peace and grace and Jesus, our battle-scarred brother, face to face. Jesus is the only one offering you a future beyond suffering. I understand the temptation to want to reject Jesus because of suffering. God's people are constantly complaining, crying out to God, saying, "What are you doing?" Brenda, I love Brenda's honesty, talking about the anger. I get that. We all get that. The God of heaven gets that. But the thing to do in the midst of suffering is not to reject Jesus. The thing to do is make your complaint and address it to the manager. Invite him into the valley of the shadow with you, to weep with you, to walk with you. And pray that he would give you that hope of, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even though they die, yet they will live. Do you believe this? Well, do you? Do you believe that? Maybe you've started to believe it. Maybe you've started to sense the reality of Jesus, the goodness of Jesus, the trustworthiness of Jesus, even tonight. Or maybe you've felt far from Jesus for quite some time, and maybe you felt like you're lost in the dark. And you want to know Jesus again. You want to know his closeness. You want to know him walking with you through suffering. Can I just offer a prayer? Can I just offer some words that you might want to echo in your heart? And just to say, Jesus, it is horrible here in the dark. Be with me. Weep with me. Walk with me. Is that something I can pray now? Why don't we just bow our heads and let me lead in a prayer. And the words I pray are not magic. You can make this prayer your own silently in your own heart, but allow me to offer the sorts of words that you might want to say to Jesus. The resurrection and the life. Lord Jesus, this is a hard world. There is so much darkness. And at times we feel completely lost. Lord Jesus, meet us. Meet me in the darkness. Show me your love. Show me your suffering and your cross. Show me your resurrection and your new life. Lord Jesus, walk with me. Lead me. Comfort me. Take me through this dark valley and out into your glorious future. In your name.